Hello, this is Kade the Wizard Wells coming to you really early from my classroom. Wanted to talk about the significance of modeling. I mentioned modeling a lot in terms of playing D&D, especially, but all the things that we do as teachers, we are models at all times. Not always good ones, but when we're doing classwork and projects and things, modeling is of absolute paramount importance for removing resistance, for showing what excellence looks like, all the things. And sometimes these models are not easy. I wanted to show you my model of short, spooky stories that my kids will make. And so I literally show them this video as an example of here's exactly what you're doing. It took a decent amount of work to make it, but you only make them once until you're sick of them, and then you can make another one. Um, it turned out pretty cool, and I think it gives the kids a nice model of excellence. And I actually, at the time that I made it, had to ask kiddos to train me to use the editing software, which is just iMovie, but I had never done anything on that particular program before. So learning from students also validates their experiences of learning from you. Just keep these things in mind. Modeling is absolutely paramount, and one of the easiest ways to deliver complex instructions in a very succinct way. I hope you enjoy it. Goodbye.
Valley of the Dead by Kade C. Wells. Caleb Kane rode his horse through the heat of the desert as the sun dipped low against the red mountains in the distance, his faded and rusty hat pulled down against the last ruddy rays trying to shine in his eyes. Vultures swarmed overhead as if expectantly waiting for the traveling meat to fall dead so they could pick the eyes and flesh off the bone. Caleb's saddle creaked with each step of his mare, Spook, a speckled Mustang most often favored by the Indians. The smell of sweat, dust, and leather was a scent that was a part of Caleb's very essence, dirt and weather a part of his life. Pulling against the saddle from a rope tied to the saddle horn was a Navajo Indian, a bounty Caleb had attained near El Paso, an aging chief named Smokehand. He'd been looking for this native a very long time. The price on the Indian's head was too much for any bounty hunter to refuse, but the reputation that began to precede Smokehand did detour more than a few. Many had tried to capture him and failed. Some tried and succeeded only to lose their minds, followed by the mysterious loss of life or flat-out disappearance. Indeed, the captors of Chief Smokehand had all met an end that was worse than bad, but they were not Caleb Kane. Caleb was not like other men, and more like an Indian than a white man in action and tradition. He'd been raised by the Cherokee, the product of a white soldier having taken his liberties with a Cherokee maiden. Caleb was raised as one of the tribe, loved, nurtured, taught ways of hunting and tracking, shown the traditions and told the stories that made up the blood of his mother's people. They called him Little Fire because he had a temper that would flare when the other boys of the tribe bullied him for his white skin. This upbringing made Caleb aware of things like legends, myths, and curses of the various tribes of the natives' people, as many of these stories were shared among them and not exclusive to the Cherokee that raised him. Despite all this, he could hardly remember being a boy at all. He'd been living with a white family in West Texas since he was 10 and had almost no memory of how he got there. He had been stolen or delivered or found was anyone's guess. His adopted parents told him he just wandered onto the farm one day, unable to talk, and they took care of him ever since. But Caleb couldn't recall any of it, and since he'd become an adult, he could care less about the past. He was far more concerned with his future filled with bags of money. Smokehand had been murmuring for days under his breath, a prayer that Caleb couldn't make out over the sound of his mare's hooves and the dry desert wind that seemed to blow sand and dirt into his very soul with a haunting melody that sounded off the rocks like the low whistle of a bottle. Caleb had paid the muttering little attention for the last several days, but it was beginning to irritate him for some reason he could not define. Maybe he was just sick of the sound. He'd been on the trail for a week, headed west into Mexico to turn Smokehand into the local authorities there that wanted him. The heat of the summer had not left the desert, even in the current month of October, and water had come in short supply as the rider and his prisoner strode across the wasted plains of dust, cacti, coyotes, and rattlesnakes. Ahead, the red sandstone mountains loomed, growing ever darker as the sun dipped lower behind them. The reds, oranges, and yellows of sunset were beginning to be replaced by the purples and lavenders of twilight and all the shadows that keep them company. The yipping howls of coyotes were a chorus added to by the symphonic rattle of snakes' tails. It sounded as if the rattlers were everywhere, One of them even sprung out from where it had hidden from the sun during the day under a rock that Spook's right foot got a little too close to, but the horse was very nimble, and her ancestors were accustomed to such threats as rattlesnakes, and she was able to prance quickly out of the way. The horse whinnied and puffed in disdain, clopping its feet loudly to set off other rattlesnakes that might be laying in wait. Bats began to zip through the darkening sky as the first and brightest stars appeared along with the thinnest sliver of a crescent moon. The rocky sandstone valley opened up before captor and prisoner. Smoke Hand spoke in his own dialect, words he assumed Caleb wouldn't understand. What the chief could never have known was that Caleb spoke with natives often. It was a requirement of his job, and part of his childhood. Caleb listened but did not reply to the statement. Now we come to the Valley of the Dead, a place you will never again leave, cowboy. The darkness settled in quickly in the valley that was almost more akin to a narrow canyon with its steep and rocky slopes that jutted upward almost completely vertical in places. As the last of the purple sky bled to blackness, Caleb was striking his flint and steel to catch a bit of tinder to make his fire. Each strike sent a flash through the valley, reflecting off the red rocks and sagebrush, bright amidst the thickening dark. A spark stuck in the tinder, and Caleb blew gently on it to bring the fire to bear. The first crackling came from the fuel, mostly sage stalks, which would burn hot and quick, and the warmth that would come from it was welcomed in the desert that cooled so quickly at night, especially this night. Indeed, the fire came none too soon, as Caleb had begun to shiver against the dry chill and pondered about the severity of such cold. He'd survived desert environments many times, and he noted the rapid frigidity to be a bit more than out of the ordinary. Again, Smoke Hand spoke in his native tongue. The cold wind comes before the spirits. Shut your mouth, savage, replied Caleb in Navajo. I don't want to hear your filthy tongue. In fact, no one does. Keep up your talking, and I'll take the tongue that makes the noise. Smoke Hand smiled. You know the words of my people. That will be good for you when they come to claim your spirit. Almost as if in reply, the rattlesnakes all shook at once, each of them encroaching on the light of the fire. See, they come for you now. Caleb stood with his back to the fire for a moment, looking out into the deep darkness of the valley. Only a rusty light from the fire hit the red rocks of it, giving Caleb enough light to see only what? Snakes. Hundreds of them, sliding through rock and sand coming towards the firelight. They rattled continuously, in a chorus that became so loud as an echo in the valley that it was hard to believe it was real. It was a sinister concert of maracas. Coyotes yipped and howled further up in the rocks. Bats zipped back and forth in the night, squealing and screeching, echoing off the rock with the rest of the sounds in the valley. In the depths of the valley, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own. Smoke Hand began to laugh. Caleb turned on his heel to face the chief. I thought I told you to shut your mouth. You cannot silence my voice, cowboy, for it is eternal. Caleb angrily stepped the 3 paces to where Smoke Hand was tied to a large rock, preparing to gag the native with the piece of rope now in his hands. He'd threatened to take his tongue, but he couldn't risk killing the man. The price on his head was too high. Caleb stepped near the stone that held Smoke Hand captive. The coiled rattler shot out from a shadow of the rock, biting Caleb just above the boot. Son of a! Said Caleb as he stumbled away from the serpent in surprise, the pain and poison of the bite not yet registering. His stumbling took him too close to the edge of the firelight. He tried to stop himself from taking another step, but the uneven ground filled with rough debris of the desert made his boots slip on the rock, and he went down to the dirt on his hands and knees in a circle of blackness beyond the firelight. Snap, 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 came the teeth of several coiled snakes that struck in unison as his hands and knees hit the ground. The attack was over in a split second. The poison began to boil his blood. Caleb crawled backwards like a crab to the very edge of the fire, attempting to elude the snakes with its heat. His vision began to blur, his mind clouded. A weakness came over him, and his limbs seemed not to respond to his commands. He could hear Smoke Hand's laugh. Through his foggy eyes, he swore he saw Smoke Hand stand unbound and then sit cross-legged by the fire. The native looked to the licking flames, the light dancing off the man's dark eyes like a mysterious veil of reality. You will now feel the slow call of death, the same call heard by my people. when the white devils arrived in our lands. Caleb's head reeled. He heard the chanting coming from Smokehand and the sound of drums coming from nowhere and everywhere. Disembodied forms seemed to appear out of the shadows and then vanish as if they had never been. Skulls gnashing their teeth, piles of bones seeming to rise up out of the sand, devils from some hell unseen, ghosts, specters of... Who were they? Their very entities seemed twisted together into one undulating form, an impossible blend of being that twisted and writhed as one and yet was made of many. Then one came very close, stretching away from the other, twisting spirits, almost as if fighting against them, and reached its hand out to touch his ever-paling face, bringing its shadowy head very close to his, as if to give him an embrace. He recognized her then, a native princess named White Rin, a woman he'd killed for money long ago. She continued forward and kissed him so gently it could barely be felt by the skin, but inside his soul a pain was wrenching all the way down. He poured sweat and seemed hot and cold at the same time. His mouth went dry and it became increasingly difficult for him to keep his head up. Finally, there was no more fight in him. With the resonant whispers and wails of the dead all around him, he fell to the ground, his face pressed against the sand. The strange sounds of the night were still ringing in his ears. The coyotes, the snakes, the bats were backdropped by the occasional pop of a coal in the fire. After a period of time which he could not begin to track, he forced himself up to his hands and knees with all his strength and drug himself over to lean against a giant boulder. He couldn't see Smokehand any longer, couldn't see much of anything except the darkness that tunneled in on his vision with deeper and deeper darkness. By the time he crawled to the boulder, he had nothing left to give. He couldn't move at all, and his vision was limited to the waning light of the fire dying just in front of him. He supposed he was dipping in and out of consciousness, but he felt more like he was dipping in and out of life itself. He was cold, so very cold, and covered in perspiration. It was in this place, in the in-between, where Caleb saw Smokehand again. "You will die, cowboy, for betraying our people," said the chief, "for turning your back on your birth mother and using us for your coin and fame." Smokehand spit at the ground near Caleb. As the spittle hit the sand, it sizzled like acid. Caleb replied, "You are not my people." He wasn't sure if he'd really said it or if it was just in his head. "Your kind terrorized territory to territory, scalping, killing, stealing, raping." "And white people have achieved all this and worse," replied the chief. "It would take 100 lifetimes to enact the proper revenge for all that's been done to us." Caleb then heard the scream of his Mustang mare and got a blurred vision of the animal rearing up, stamping its front hooves and bucking wildly against something. There were darting shadows all around its legs, forms of gray that growled and yelped. The horse screamed a shrill cry of panic into the air, and soon after he heard the mare no more. Out again. Awake again. A dozen pair of yellow eyes shined in the dying firelight, teeth bared and gnashing, tongues drooling blood. The eyes and teeth got closer and closer. He couldn't move. The first coyote tested him with a nip on the leg and then bounded a short distance away with the nibble of meat in its mouth. Caleb wasn't sure if he felt it or not, whether he was alive or dead or something else. He looked down at the wound caused by the coyote, the blood leaking out into the desert sand. The next coyote came to nip up a piece, then another, and another. So small and quick were the bites that Caleb had to question what they were doing. In his state, a coyote would likely just go for the throat, but these animals just continued taking a piece at a time. Caleb kept drifting in and out during all this. He was trying to fend off the coyotes, but they became more and more persistent. His Bowie knife had found its way into his hand somehow, and with it he slashed and cut at the scavenging canines. Finally, Caleb remembered his revolver. He drew it, cocked it, pointed it, and shot, and shot, and shot. The coyotes seemed to vanish. Caleb's head slumped low, his chin against his chest. He was very cold, and he knew he was dying. Blood flowed out of his body from the dozen of bites. His heart and mind continued to slow from the poison of the rattlers. Caleb worked out the words. "All done but for the crying," he said with a weak chuckle and a cough. The moon dipped below the mountains, and the stars gave way to the dirty blue sky of early dawn, and a single ribbon of fog wavered close to the ground, a dedicated cloud that refused to let the desert make it relevant. Smoke Hand appeared as if from the mist of morning. He walked over to crouch in front of Caleb, who barely drew breath. Caleb struggled to lift his eyes to look at the man. You will die here now, cowboy. You will die for all that you are, all that you are not, and all that you have done, he said in words that seemed to swim in Caleb's head. Smoke Hand didn't laugh, didn't smile. He looked into Caleb's fading eyes intently as if waiting for the light to go out. Do you know why they call me Smoke Hand, cowboy? Caleb just spat with no other reply. Because the magic in me makes the hand of my enemy weak. Make them as harmless to me as smoke, he finished. Don't you remember me, boy? Asked Smoke Hand as he gripped a handful of ashes from the edge of the fire. Don't you remember me, little fire? With that, Smoke Hand blew the ashes into Caleb's eyes, and it stung and burned like acid. Caleb lifted the dead weight of the revolver still in his hand and brought the barrel beneath Smoke Hand's chin, pulling back the hammer as he did so. Smoke Hand smiled then, smiled wide, and he laughed. He laughed a full belly laugh that reverberated off all the rocks in the valley, resounding off all the disappearing moon and stars, echoing through the forms of time and space. Go to hell, panted Caleb with nearly all the strength he had left. We are already here, said Smoke Hand. You and I, both. Caleb pulled the trigger and blackness took him. The waiting vultures could hear the mad cacophony of laughter as they sunned themselves on the red rocks that made up the top ridge of the valley. They all looked down at the disturbance of their morning quiet to see a man who had apparently cut himself 100 times with a bowie knife, drank nearly 2 liters of whiskey, and in the end put a gun beneath his chin where one final snap of the hammer and the blast of the gun was the last sound that disrupted the valley for a long time to come.
Hello, this is Kade the Wizard Wells coming to you really, really early from my classroom. Wanted to talk about the significance of modeling. I mentioned modeling a lot in terms of playing D&D, especially, but all the things that we do as teachers, we are models at all times. Not always good ones, but when we're doing classwork and projects and things, modeling is of absolute paramount importance for removing resistance, for showing what excellence looks like, all the things. And sometimes these models are not easy. I wanted to show you my model of short, spooky stories that my kids will make. And so I literally show them this video as an example of here's exactly what you're doing. It took a decent amount of work to make it, but you only make them once until you're sick of them, and then you can make another one. It turned out pretty cool, and I think it gives the kids a nice model of excellence. And I actually, at the time that I made it, had to ask kiddos to train me to use the editing software, which is just iMovie, but I had never done anything on that particular program before. So learning from students also validates their experiences of learning from you. Just keep these things in mind. Modeling is absolutely, absolutely paramount, and one of the easiest ways to deliver complex instructions in a very succinct way. I hope you enjoy it. Goodbye.